Tate Publishing and Enterprises, along with Tate Out Loud Audiobooks, presents The Story and Poems of the Boy from Dingle Hole Road, written by Alfred E. Luckette, narrated by Josh Kilbourne. Introduction. When I call someone on the phone, I announce myself as Al Luckette from Kirkville, New York. Almost nobody really understands why I use this introduction. I get a few laughs about it, and some even mimic me by giving me their address with their full name. There was a time in my life, though, when I wasn't sure where I would be tomorrow. A time between, let's say, age 4 to my teen years. My father was the catalyst throughout this era, and this book is not about him, but me. He is the driving force in the book, the one that propelled my family from place to place. He tried everything you could imagine, and some things you couldn't. He owned and operated restaurants. He had garages. He had stores. He operated a private detective agency and studied law. He even had an evangelistic ministry. When he was in his late 20s, he built homes in the Carolinas. Later, he remodeled in the French Quarters in New Orleans. Sometimes now, I think of my life as a boy on a roller coaster. I was on a wild ride. It seemed to have no end. Hanging onto the bar on the front of the roller coaster car, being lifted, then dropped. Everyone around watching the ride, some shaking their heads, some holding their mouth, gasping at the wild turns and loops. During this time of my life, I never had anyone outside the family as a friend, although I met some interesting people and had temporary friends for very short periods of time. I am the oldest of 8 children born to my parents. All my siblings experienced some of the same things I did, but not to the same degree. They would tell you they were on the roller coaster, but they had back seats. I sat up front. After my marriage at age 20, both my wife and I got saved, and eventually I became a minister of the gospel, now for over 30 years. We have 3 children, 2 girls and a boy, and 3 grandsons. I worked in a factory to supplement my income and retired with a small pension. We live in the suburbs of Syracuse, New York, in a community called Kirkville. But I didn't always live in Kirkville, and that's my story. I named the book Dingle Hole Road for a couple reasons. One, I lived on Dingle Hole Road during my early years, and probably spent more time there than any other place before my 16th birthday. I grew up on Dingle Hole Road, and it prepared me for my ride through my early years. Secondly, the name Dingle Hole Road seemed to denote something like a hole in the wall place, out of the way, or out of place. It surely was located at the end of the world. It could have been called Timbuktu or Shangri-La. It's all the same. In its time, it was the lowest point on earth for me, and the highest point of my early life after I left it. I learned responsibility and how to work with my hands. I was 6 when we moved there, and almost 9 when we left. I had always felt the hand of God in my life, how He protected me and watched me. Several times I faced death and God pulled me through. He knows the future, and man cannot undo what He has a design on. Now let's see, where should we start? How about at the beginning? The early years. Early in the morning of May 22nd, 1944, I was born on the 5th floor in Memorial Hospital in Syracuse, New York. We didn't live in Syracuse very long after that. Our family moved to the south, where my dad had a business somewhere in the Carolinas building homes. We jumped around a little before I was 2, but at one point, Dad was shot in the leg with a .45 pistol. That brought us back to Syracuse. We lived with my dad's mother in town. She was a wonderful person with a deep, full faith. Grandma spoke with broken English. She was firm and wasn't afraid to speak her mind. Her weakness was her family. She tried to help out, even when the problems were overwhelming. My father had his leg in a cast. We lived there, Mom, Dad, and at this point 3 kids, my sister Regina, my brother Paul, and myself, in a small upstairs apartment. I still remember that small apartment, even though I was not much over 3 years old. This went on for a while, and then we moved. This time we ended up in New Orleans. Dad was involved in the construction business again. He had an office with a big fan, and that's all I knew about his job. My sister Linda was born while we lived there. We had a small one-room apartment. There was a bed on one side, a couch in the middle, and a kitchenette on the other side. A wire was strung over the middle of the room with a green army blanket hanging as a divider. My mother had a midwife come when she delivered Linda. Like it happened yesterday, Regina, Paul, and I sat on the couch just feet from the blanket. We heard our mother moan and groan, then the baby screaming. The midwife said it was a girl. We looked at each other in amazement. Now there was 4.
Christmas car fire. For some reason, we had to make an hasty retreat out of town. It was winter and our car was loaded. We sat on piles of clothes and tools and junk. Back then, there were no superhighways. You traveled on state roads, which passed through the towns. Now, our road took us to Hagerstown, Maryland. It was Christmas Eve and snowing hard. The weather was very cold when we approached a traffic light on the top of the hill in the heart of town. As we attempted to go, the car exploded and burst into flames. We scrambled from the car, my mom carrying Linda and dragging little Polly. Regina and I were pulled from the car by my father. We were poorly dressed for the weather and were shivering in the blowing snow. Almost instantly, there were fire trucks and policemen everywhere. Regina and I had been looking at all the Christmas lights just before the fire, and it took a few moments to come to the realization that it was Christmas. The police took us to the station for a warm glass of chocolate milk. Then one of the policemen called a fireman over to us and asked if he could take some of us home for the night. I ended up going to his house for the night. The fireman had a son my age. They had a beautiful ranch-style home, neatly decorated for the season. There was a Christmas tree with an electric train around the base of the floor, and the son wanted to show me his train, but I was hungry and tired and confused by the night's happenings. The fireman's wife directed the boy to take me into his room to get some clothes. I followed him into a clean, small room with a bed, a dresser, and a closet. He took from the dresser a pair of socks and pants and a shirt. It was his own room. I was amazed and wondered at having one's own dresser in his own room. It was beyond my comprehension at the time. I had up to now only had things in a shopping bag, and the only socks I had were the ones I wore. Everything we owned was destroyed in the fire. The town gave us the money to get back to Syracuse. It was a train ride out of town. The only thing I really remember about the ride was Paul and I running up and down the aisle of the train car. So back to Syracuse we went. We lived right at the end of Park Ave on West Street. From our house, it was a straight walk to the first school I attended. Fraser School was located on the other end of Park Ave, about 8 blocks from our house. I had learned to write my name before I went to school, so I guess being the oldest, my mom spent more time with me, teaching me my letters and my numbers. I liked to draw even then, and would draw cars and houses, and I would spend hours alone in the corner just drawing.
The first day of school was a rude awakening for me. My parents spent a lot of energy telling me what to expect. My mother even taught me to tie my shoes before I started school. She would say, "You can't go to school if you can't tie your shoes." When I learned, she would make me show off my shoe tying talent to anyone and everyone, then highlighted the event with the remark, "Now he's ready for school." If I had an idea what I was getting into, I would have resisted the lessons. Mom and I walked down Park Avenue to the school. We met the teacher, we had the tour of the room, and then my mother gave me a hug and a kiss and started out. I was not ready for this. I made a scene. That's putting it mildly. So for the first week, she stayed all day. That weekend, she rehearsed how I would be all right alone, and could play with the blocks and draw on the chalkboard. Everything was good up to the moment she tried to sneak out. I saw her out on the sidewalk, and I went berserk. I bolted to the door. She heard my screaming and returned. She had to stay with me up to October 31st. That day, I told her I could do it alone. I never thought about the other kids at home. They had to have someone watching them for almost 2 months. One day after my mother left me in the school, I planned an escape. I reached the main doorway ahead of the teacher. In those days, the doors swung in, and I couldn't open the door. She swooped me up and carried me back under her arm. I was kicking and screaming. I was terrified of staying there. Dingle Hole Road. Near the end of that summer, we moved out of Baldwinsville to Phoenix, New York. The house was located just outside of town on Dingle Hole Road. The family with the boys helped us move in a large old truck with all our possessions on a hot day. Some of the boys rode in the back of the truck on the piles of clothes. When we got there, it took only a short time to unload. Ma had things piled into the very small house, 2 small bedrooms and a kitchen. The house had no electricity or running water. We weren't there a half hour when my father assembled a kite and had it up. It was windy. The kite kept twirling, and my father kept adding more tail. He was totally engulfed in flying that kite. Meantime, Mom and I were looking over the situation we were in. When we began to look around in the house, we noticed there were no wall switches for the lights. The kitchen sink had no faucets. There was a single lantern on the counter next to the sink. Ma kind of laughed and said something about not having to worry about the utility bills being too high. There was more. No toilet in the house. There was a small shed in the back about 20 yards from the house. I was informed that it was the toilet. I still remember the smell when I first opened the door. Unbelievable. It was a small room about 4 feet by 3 feet. A board about 2 feet high ran along the back. It had 2 round holes that would be the family toilet for over 3 years, summer and winter. The front yard had a well. It was covered with a 4x8 sheet of plywood. To extract water, you threw a pail with a rope attached down the hole. After sliding the plywood aside, then pulled the pail up with the water. All the time we lived there, we had to fetch the water from the well. Winters were tough because you had to get close to the well hole and not slip in because of the ice. Sometimes there was so much snow we couldn't get water till we got the well cover shoveled off. I was 6 when we moved there, and I learned to get the water right off. My mother was terrified that I went near the hole, but my dad thought it was okay, and someone had to do it anyway. Dingle Hole Road was the beginning of my age of responsibility. Before I was 7, I would take on responsibilities that some grown men would not do. As time went by, we had some chickens and ducks and pigs. The most memorable thing about Dingle Hole Road was the school I attended. It was down the road and around the corner, and a way off, partially through a wooded area, up on a country route. Years later, I would bring my children to the place we lived there on Dingle Hole Road. I trekked up to where the school was located. It was actually 1 mile from the school to our house. I went to school alone back then because Regina and Paul were too young to attend. The school was a 1-room schoolhouse. It was from 1st grade to 9th. 1st grade was up front on the left side. 2nd through 7th were behind 1st. 8th and 9th were on the other side of the room. The front and right walls were all chalkboards. The chalkboards were black, and there was always some activity going on with the boards. The back of the room had a small attached coat room that also housed the wood stove. The toilet was just outside. It was a 2-seater also, just like the one at home. There was no girls' or boys' room, just a piece of wood on a nail inside. A turn of the board locked the door. The outside handle was this little black latch. If you pulled on the door and couldn't open it, that meant it was occupied. Except in the winter, when the door was just frozen. We had monitors in class, appointed by the teacher. They performed a variety of tasks, from keeping the fire going in the winter to opening and closing windows in the summer. They also had helpers, who were anywhere from 1st to 7th grade, monitors assigned jobs to the class, cleaning, sweeping, stacking wood, putting things away, or straightening out the books in the small library in the back corner of the room. Everyone, including me, had their chance at these chores. The school kids were like a family. We never fought much. If there was a spat, the teacher would fix it. There was this one kid, Arthur, an 8th grader. He was sort of small, but a head taller than me. One day we all had to go to the school Saturday morning for a shot. Arthur passed out before he got to the head of the line. I ran for the door, but my mother and the nurse caught me. It was worse by running, as everyone laughed at me. After that, some of the older boys would say, "Run, Al! Arthur looks a little pale." We had the greatest time when a holiday came. On Halloween, the teacher would string up donuts across the room at the party, and then dare us to try to bite one with our hands behind our backs. He would shake the lines, and we had powder all over our faces. The biggest party was at Christmas. We would start getting ready weeks before the holiday. The teacher would start the singing lessons and practice the carols. The upperclassmen would stand in the back, the lower grades in the front, all standing in the front of the small school room. My position was right center, the front row. I was one of the smaller kids. Our teacher would tell us to watch him. He would give us these breathing exercises. When he raised his wand, we would take in a deep breath. When he lowered the wand, we would exhale. This went on for a time, trying to get the class to start all together. Then at last he raised the wand, holding our breath, waiting for the wand to come down. Suddenly, Arthur passed out, right behind me. He fell forward, almost taking me to the ground with him. The teacher dropped the wand and scrambled to the front of the room, reaching for Arthur. I was already crying and went to my desk. Arthur was quickly revived, and everyone was settling down. Arthur was short of breath and just lost it. The teacher could not convince me to return to my place in the choir. When I went home that night, I told my mother what happened. I didn't want to go to school anymore, or at least I surely didn't want to take part in the Christmas play. A few days later, the teacher moved me a few places to the left in the choir, and I was back in, singing, one eye on the teacher's wand, and the other on Arthur. It never occurred to me what a great school that was. I had attended schools all over the country. Some of them were good schools. In fact, most were good schools. But that one-room school offered the best lessons in teaching responsibility and brotherhood. Our recess was like something you might read only in a storybook. The kids played together, 1st graders with 7th or 8th graders. I was only a 1st grader, and then 2nd grader, but I can't remember anyone fighting. Now, there were 2 children that lived near the school, a sister and brother. Honestly can't remember their names, which is quite ironic. The boy was about a year younger than me and didn't attend school. His sister was my age and was in the 1st grade with me. She had almost white hair, as did her brother, and I thought she was the cutest girl in New York, or anywhere for that matter. I was so shy. I would never say that to her or anyone else. One summer day, Paul, Regina, and I were walking down the road to the school. It was near the end of the school year, so Mom said I could take them with me. As we approached the school, the 2 blonde kids came running out to meet us. The little blonde girl began to swoon. "Who is this cute boy?" pointing to my brother Paul. Regina did all the talking, as she was a talker. I was too scared to say anything. I just kept on walking. Paul always attracted the girls. He was like a magnet to the girls. Years later, when Paul finally started school, there was one incident. The school system in Phoenix finally centralized. Partly because my father complained, a school bus picked us up at our door and brought us to the central school in Phoenix. Paul was just a kindergartner, and near the end of school that year, something happened. On a Saturday, cars were dropping off kindergarten girls dressed in dresses with presents. They informed my mother that they were there for Paul's birthday party. Forget that Paul was born on December 1st. We had no way to entertain these kids. My mother was helpless. She could not even give them a glass of Kool-Aid. When one mother came, She told her the dilemma. They both laughed, and the woman said that Paul told her daughter that Saturday was his birthday. Paul got a house full of presents. My parents were not mad at him. I think they were bewildered and surprised at his actions. They just shook their heads, and I remember my father saying, "And don't you try to pull a stunt like that again." Paul's reason? He had heard that another person in class had a birthday party and got a lot of presents, so he told everyone it was his birthday. The girls in his class took it as a chance to party with Paul. Paul's birthday wouldn't come for another 6 months, so he actually had 2 birthdays that year. Later, Regina and I would say Paul was catching up to us by having 2 birthdays a year. Paul was always playing catch-up, or hooky, or something through the years. The Vanishing Babysitter. One afternoon, Mom and Dad were going into town and left a young lady to watch us. She seemed quite capable. Mom told her where the diapers were for the baby, what to give us to eat, and they left. Everything went okay for about an hour, and then she told us she was going to pick berries just down the road. She took a small pail. It was one of those sand buckets that a kid would take to the beach, and she swung it by the handle. "This will do just fine," she said. She led us out to the road. I was holding Johnny, the baby, and Regina had Maria's hand. The babysitter pointed down the road and informed us that she had seen a patch of berries just past the curve. She said she would get them for an after-dinner treat. There we stood, huddled together in the middle of that dirt road, watching the babysitter slowly stroll away, swinging the pail, occasionally turning around and waving to us. "Don't worry, I won't be long," she hollered back at us. We waved back, but didn't move from the spot she left us. Slowly, she disappeared around the distant curve in the road. We began to reason together as to how long she might be gone. We weren't worried about the little sand bucket. We never played with it much anyway. The minutes turned into hours, and there we stood, as though frozen in the middle of Dingle Hole Road. We scuffed our feet in the dirt of the road, searching with our eyes to the end of the road. Little Johnny was starting to get heavy, and he needed a change. The sun was setting against the trees in front of us, so we moved to the house, like a troop of soldiers holding on to one another. By the time we entered the house, we realized how dark it was getting. I scrambled to find a diaper and made a first-time change. By now, Johnny was crying pretty good, and Maria and Linda were echoing their fears. Regina and I tried to light a candle but couldn't find matches. Suddenly, it was dark, and we now figured out the babysitter was not coming back. We huddled in the kitchen area, and Regina was bawling. Paul was sitting somewhere on the floor near the bottom of my chair, and the other girls were sitting in the other chairs, also crying. I was holding the baby, rocking him back and forth, trying desperately to comfort him. Then a noise in the driveway alerted us to the return of our parents. They came in and quickly lit the oil lamp. The dim light displayed my brother and sisters huddled on the floor in the corner. My parents couldn't believe what happened. 2 things about that event are burned into my memory even after 55 years. One was us kids standing and staring down the road at the sunset peeking through the trees, hoping against hope to see the babysitter coming back up the road, and the dreadful helplessness of the darkness, with no parent to give light and comfort. After that, we would talk about the vanishing babysitter. Years later, I would hear the gospel, how a Savior went away but promised to return, and how men are waiting for his return. It reminded me of that road, and that sunset, and how we waited. There are differences, but the way we waited and the hope we expressed is very much like the gospel. The darkness when hope is abandoned is also like the gospel message. Father and his quotes. Dingle Hole Road was my growing up time. I learned and remembered more things at that place than anywhere else. Even some of the words used there were etched in my memory. My father had certain statements or sayings to express his feelings. These expressions were designed to get our attention, and they did. If he and my mother went to the store, he would tell me, "Don't open this door to anyone, even if the President of the United States knocks." I guess it meant no matter how important a person is at the door, don't open the door. Sometimes when they got back, I would say the president didn't stop by. My father hated to get mocked in any way, even if I was only kidding, even if I was only 7. You want trouble from me? Keep it up. Keep it up was another one. Not just the words, but the way he said it. It was a threat. None of us could joke with him. He could demoralize you with his words. My favorite phrase was, "I'll cut off your arm and beat you with the bloody end of it." Whenever he got mad at me, he would rattle off this expression. It was not just words rolling off his tongue. It was the ultimate threat. His finger followed his eyes. He looked directly at you. It was not a casual expression. There was no swearing or cussing. "I'll cut off your arm and beat you with the bloody end of it." Sometimes when I was relaxing or walking to school, I would think about just how he was going to cut off my arm. Would he use a saw or a knife, or maybe he would just rip it out of the socket? I wasn't sure I would survive the amputation, so the beating would not hurt too bad, I would assure myself. Regina would snicker after he said it. Not to his face, but when we were out of sight and sound. She would rehearse the phrase with a joke. The threat was only directed at me. She was not threatened. After a while, I got used to those words and realized it was an overstatement, in a threat form. He really wouldn't cut my arm off, I thought, but I was good just in case. With all my dad's faults, I can at least say he never cussed or swore in our presence, nor did he ever have beer in the refrigerator. We never saw him drunk. He took us to church, and sometimes when he wouldn't go, he sent us. He was a smoker. He smoked Camel cigarettes. Most of his family and friends smoked. When they got around the table and drank coffee, the room was filled with smoke. My father loved the holidays. He was like a kid at Christmas and Easter and when it came to Halloween. He would send us out trick-or-treating when it was possible, and he would allow decorating during those times. On July 4th, he would come up with some fireworks, again, when it was possible. One time when we lived in California, he got a hold of some fireworks and burned his hand quite badly. He was protective of us and would not allow us to wander around the neighborhoods wherever we happened to live. We didn't have too much time to wander anyway. He kept us busy all the time. Pilgrim Mother. My mother was a tourist and a pilgrim. She had very little voice in where we would live or what we would do when we got there. She would complain to Dad about conditions. He would say he was doing the best that he could. Sometimes she would take a job here or there to buy food for the table or pay the rent. We had plenty of hard times. Mom had to make do with feeding us. When the kids were little, she often mixed water and syrup for a baby formula. She had to take all the hand-me-down clothing and make it fit us as best she could. She was never too proud to take a handout if it meant food for the table. She learned to cook what she had. Many times we had potato peeling soup. One time we had ketchup soup on an open hearth with black gnats that looked like pepper. Sometimes she cooked oatmeal and divided it to us for the only meal of the day. It broke her heart to live on the road, but she did so, always hoping things would get better. Too many times she had to start over. One time she sat on the curb with her little band of kids, all of us crying, not knowing what our next move would be. She worked when she could, in big factories working with electric components, in a cookie factory in California, washing dishes, washing clothes, in restaurants. Her desire to survive and care for her family was utmost in her heart and mind. Later, when most of her children were grown and on their own, she raised the last two, Daniel and Sue Ellen, by working in a hospital as a nurse's aide. She did so for 20 years, retiring with a pension. She was a woman of great courage and faith. In the spring of the first year, Dad started bringing old cars out to Dingle Hole Road. I think he got them from the dealers where he worked, either fixing cars or selling them. The cars were junkers. We would gut them out and burn them, cut them up and junk them. It wasn't long before I learned to use the torches to cut the motors, doors, and fenders off the cars. Dad would leave the car with instructions. Mom and I would cut out the motors and burn the cars. Later, we would load the metal and junk it. There wasn't a lot of that going on, just 2 or 3 times a month. Ma washed our clothes in one of those galvanized wash tubs. She had a washboard and scrubbed the clothes back and forth, up and down on that board. It seemed like she was always washing clothes, and I was always carrying water. That old tub was either full of old clothes or used to wash us kids. Ma would put the tub on the kitchen stove and light a fire under it. We would put water into the tub and wait till it got warm. Then, starting with the girls, Ma would wash us 2 at a time. If the water got too dirty, she would dump it and start again, warming the water. Sometimes we washed on the stove with the fire under us. Our parents would wash in the tub also. We would be sent out whenever one of them wanted to bathe. With 5 kids, the cleaning process was ongoing. Before we moved out of that place, we did get electricity. I think we had a plug in the kitchen and one in the bedroom. It amounted to a couple of extension cords strung across the floor. We even had a TV for a while, which was an on-again, off-again thing. Country schooling. My first year of school, as I said, this was one of the greatest times of my life. In first grade, I sat right up front on the left side of the class. Behind me was second grade, then third, and so on to the back of the room. The 8th and ninth were on the right side. The teacher would lecture the 8th and ninth grade classes in the sciences, sometimes math, physics, or even English. The rest of the class would be left to studying, but some of us underclassmen couldn't help but get our ear into the teacher's study. When he would ask a question to the 9th graders, we would wave our arms wildly in the air. "See," the teacher would exclaim, "even the first graders know this one." Then he would turn to us, shaking his finger, tell us to get back to our own studies and stop trying to shame the 9th graders. I really can't remember his name, but he was a firm, just leader and teacher. He kept the peace and always settled differences between the students. Everybody liked him. One day, our teacher gave the first graders our spelling words. One of the words was if, and he instructed us to write the word 50 times on our paper. Well, I was always trying to take a shortcut and began putting a column of I's down the page. I had just started on the F's when he caught me. "Alfred, what are you doing?" he said. He took my paper and held it up and asked the class to help me spell if. Everyone in the class had to spell it. Then he asked me to go to the board and write, "I will spell if all the way out." When I finished, after he helped me with the spelling, he said it looked great and to do it 100 times on the board. I filled the front board and the side board, and it took me the rest of the day. But I could spell those words pretty well after that, and he never caught me taking that shortcut again. Regina was ready to come to school the second year. She never went to kindergarten. Dad didn't want her to walk to the old school and wait for a bus. It took a while, but he got the school system to pick us up and take us to the 2-room schoolhouse. There was less learning and more confusion there. The teachers seemed to spend more time arguing than teaching. Who had this and who had that, and where are the scissors? The whole thing seemed to be thrown together to satisfy the school system, and the kids were along for the ride. This fiasco only lasted to the end of the school year, and then Phoenix centralized. This meant the school had to pick us up at our door and bring us to the town school in Phoenix. The Phoenix school was a brick building, 2 stories, at least. When the bus unloaded us, we walked around to the front door and waited in line for the doors to open. While we waited, Regina got acquainted with the girls her age. She was not timid when it came to talking. I, on the other hand, never said hello to anyone. If anyone wanted to say something to me, they would talk to Regina, and she would tell me when we got home. I would always say, "Don't bother me with that." I was a bona fide introvert. I would stand aloof at school waiting for the bus. I dreaded the thought of someone coming over to talk to me. I would never stand in class and give a book report. In high school, I was a loner. More than once, I told teachers that I would take the F for the book report if I had to get up in class. When it came to girls, Regina would always tease me, because I wouldn't talk to them. It wasn't that I didn't like girls. I think I was afraid of them not really liking me. Or what would they see in a person like me? I may have been a little insecure and shy, but I was also caught up in my activities and chores, which were extremely time-consuming when I was around 8 years old. We never had much homework when I attended the one-room schoolhouse. I think it was because the teacher realized most of the kids were farm people who were very busy after school. Now when the school system consolidated, the rural children were bussed into the town. The teachers there were either unaware of the circumstances or didn't care. In my own case, which was a little special because of our impoverished condition, home studies were very taxing. For one thing, there was what I had to do when I got home straight away from school. There was water to fetch from the well. Sometimes I would spend an hour just filling jugs and pans. Then whatever projects my father left me to do. Most of the time he was not there when I got home, and sometimes he would not get home till late in the evening. The other thing was the light problem. We had one main kerosene lamp. We had to use it sparingly. Mother used it in the kitchen and sometimes in the other room. It was often moved around from place to place. For me to read at dusk or dark was difficult, to say the least. I know there were others with the same problems, and I often thought about men like Abraham Lincoln, who lived in a log cabin, and must have had the problem of trying to read in the dark. I needed help with some of the work and had to ask my mother. She was not too well educated herself and had 4 other kids to tend to. She did the best she could under the circumstances. But I hated the idea of homework after a while. It was a burden and responsibility I was not ready for. By this time, my mother was pregnant for her 6th child, and my father didn't have steady work. There was just no money for anything except the bare essentials. If I had to describe the impact of homework on my life at that time, I would say it was like someone dropping bombs on our house or incoming sniper fire. It totally upset the whole household. My father never liked school and didn't go any further than 6th grade. If I had homework, I had to do it on the sly. He calmed a bit with the other kids, but with me, he always pressed the point that I had more important things to do than homework. When I had children of my own, I always made sure they had a decent place and time to study. I always took the time to look over my children's homework. I would always ask them if they had school studies to do before they got involved in other activities. I would look at the place where my son was reading a book one time and remembered myself out on Dingle Hole Road, sitting in the dark, just a few feet from the kerosene lamp, trying to make out the words on the page. Sometimes during the school year of 3rd grade, I was on recess in the schoolyard. It was a fairly small yard with a few swings and seesaws. The seesaws, as we called them, were long planks that we teeter-tottered on. The seesaws were close to the building. I had been playing in the back of the yard when the bell rang to call us to return to the class. As I was running to the door, I came upon the seesaws. Running along the side of the building, I passed one set of seesaws. Then, as I approached the second set, someone on the other side pushed down on the seesaw. My side came up, striking me on the left side of my face, hitting me in the eye, and above the eye on my forehead. Down I went. The next thing I remember was the school nurse carrying me into the building. Then the strangest thing happened. I went unconscious and dreamt of a rough texture against my body. And then something smooth seemed to come and make me better. In describing the experience, the dream started with a small animal coming into my vision. As the animal passed before me, I became frozen, unable to talk or move a muscle. Then a rough texture would come in contact with my body. It rubbed on my arm, it became more aggressive and covered my whole body. I struggled to try to speak. I thought of how I could get away from the small creature before me. Then suddenly, a smooth feeling came over my body. It took a while to erase the rough texture, but in a short time I was engulfed in this warm, smooth material. The school nurse was noticeably frightened when I awoke. I remember telling her, "It's okay. Now everything is getting smooth." After a while, the school nurse brought me home. She was very apologetic to my mother and left me on the couch in a half-conscious state. My head was swollen, my eye was closed, and I was dizzy and numb. Then it happened again, as though I were wrapped in a wool blanket, like one of those old green army blankets, and it scraped against my skin like sandpaper. I slid back and forth on it and in it. At the same time, it felt like fine, hard, sharp gravel. Then suddenly, when I thought I could take it no more, it changed, and a smooth feeling came over me. Back and forth, these feelings came and went as I lay on the couch. It was like a dream, one I could not stop. The rough and smooth were directly related to the accident. I saw the seesaw. It was a green board, and it came to my face, hitting me in the eye, then the rough, then the smooth. I dreamt this as I lay in a semi-conscious state. After the accident, for weeks and months I had that dream. Sometimes, as I was just falling to sleep, this dream would come. The condition continued even after I was married. The dream always started with the appearance of a small animal, then a feeling of complete immobility. The rough texture which I came to bear in later years, then the final smooth feeling that enveloped my being. After I came to Christ, the dream seemed to intensify and become horrible and upsetting. My wife knew about the dreams and would wake me when I began to moan. Then one day I described the dream to my minister. He told me the next time I had the dream, ask Jesus to go after the small animal and take it away. Well, I had the dream shortly after that, and I found it difficult to even say the name Jesus. But I did, and the animal fled the scene, and I immediately awoke. It happened again, and I repeated my plea, Jesus, help me. Take this from me. And after that, the dreams stopped. I mean, completely stopped. I had that dream for 17 years, sometimes 2 or 3 times a week. Now, I don't even think about it. I used to call it my Dingle Hole Road dream.